Hi, this is your captain speaking. While I do a lot of speed paints on this channel, I've been really wanting to do an actual tutorial on how I draw digitally and how I use Photoshop. I use Photoshop CS5 and I've been using it for about 6 years, so I'm very familiar with it, but I'm going to try to explain all the hoops I jump through on an almost daily basis to make digital art. The picture I'm working on is of two original characters of mine. It's kind of a companion drawing to one I did beforehand of the same characters outside their superhero forms. So I'm going to be jumping back and forth between that drawing and this one a bit to make sure the techniques match in the end. The sketch is all done beforehand. I usually have a background color in mind before starting, and I usually set that as the background layer as opposed to the default white. I then make another layer and sketch above the background. Sketching process is usually the longest, and sometimes I leave myself notes on what I want to include later or where I'll be putting the words at the end. Okay, now I'm going to get to work on the line art on a new layer. I usually use a brush about the size of 13 pixels or 13px. I'm going to reference the companion drawing a bit more before going in. Then I'm going to speed through this so we can get to the shading process. Thank you for being patient. Let's get to work. Right here, I'm eyedropping the colors from the companion drawing and using a paint bucket to fill the new drawing. The girl is named Rosemary and the boy is Brad, and they each get their own layer for their base colors, keeping them separated. Okay. Now that Rose and Brad each have their own layers, it's time to get into some shading. Before I get into hard shading, I like to add gradients to the base colors. And in Photoshop, you can add a gradient overlay in the blending options. I'm going to take the background color and overlay the base layer with the purple to transparent gradient overlay. I'm going to do that to both Rose and Brad's layer. The default blending mode for the gradient overlay right now is multiply. I won't get into the different blending options and settings in this video, but in this recording I'm going to switch the gradient overlay blending mode a lot until I decide on one that really conveys the mood I'm trying to go for in this picture. Right here I'm making duplicates of the base color layers and of the line art layer, and then I'm merging them together. After that I put the merge layer just above the background and add a stroke outline to it from the blending options. That gives the characters an outline of my color of choice outside their line art, and it'll be used later as a selection. Now it's time for the hard shading. I'm going to use the color I used for the stroke outline to shade both characters. I take a hard brush and shade anything on the characters that cast a shadow, or where I think a shadow should be. I kind of just wing that part. I just shade where I think shade should be. Similar to gradient overlay blending mode, I kind of play around with the hard shading blending modes too. It's all about trial and error for me when it comes to blending modes. One I like to use a lot, however, is the difference option. In a nutshell, it overlays whatever you shade with a kind of complementary color of your choice. So opposite this pink I'm using is a bright lime green in Photoshop. I'm sure that's not the technical explanation, but that's how I describe it honestly, and it hasn't failed me yet. Here I go back in and finally decide on the gradient overlay for Rose. I set it back to its default multiply blending mode while leaving Brad's gradient set to difference. It gives them the contrast I want in this picture. I've also changed the shading blending mode to subtract, which is almost the same as difference, but it's easier to blend with darker colors with subtract. When I do a hard shade, I use a clipping mask to stay inside the lines essentially. I make a new layer on top of the base color layer, right-click the new layer, and then select the Create Clipping Mask option. Now whatever I draw on that layer will be attached to the layer below it, making any stray marks invisible as long as the layers are clipped. Brad's shading layer gets set to the same blending mode as Rose's, which is subtract. And again, just winging it with where I put shading and where I don't. I don't think I'll ever do a tutorial about like how I shade, like, because I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, now I want to give the line art a bit of a tint, so I'm going to make a new layer above the line art one and clip them together. I'm going to use the base colors to cover certain parts of the line art. Again, there's not much rhyme or reason, just covering what I think will look good in the end product, usually tinting any lines that don't have much space in between them. Okay, now that everything I want covered is covered, I'm going to go into the blending options of the mask layer and set the opacity to 32%. You can set it to whatever you want, but I usually set it very low. And a low number I always pick in Photoshop is my favorite number, which is 32. Now it's time to use the merge layer from earlier. We're going to select it, then go to the selection tool, then right click the document and choose load selection option. Make sure your settings look like this before you press OK, and you get a selection around the line art and base colors, aka these little moving lines. You can achieve the same outcome with the magical wand selection tool and a little patience, but I do this ahead of time to make things easier for myself later. Once everything is selected, it's time for my favorite part of coloring digitally, and that's the after lighting and effects. But before that, I'm going to add one more layer of shading across both base layers using that same pink from before. I'm just going to go over any parts that I want more dark than everything else. So like under their necks, maybe anything that's in the background more than anything else, etc. Okay, now it's time for some After Effects. I'm going to create a new layer above all the other layers I have so far, so at the very top. And using the loaded selection, I'm going to fill it with the background purple. I'm then going to start messing with the blending modes again until I find one I like. Then, using the gradient tool, not the gradient overlay, I want to add another purple to transparent gradient from the top of the picture. Because I still have the characters selected with the loaded one from earlier, the gradient won't spill out to the background. Then in the blending options, I set that gradient to the saturation option with the opacity of 45%. After a quick save of the file, I'm going to get started on the highlights. I usually have a shading and lighting color for each picture. For this one, the shading color is the purple while the lighting is the pink. I'm going to take the pink from the outline and highlight both characters where I see fit on a separate layer, putting this one above the gradient one. The blending options for this layer varies too, but in this piece I set it to divide. Divide is kind of the same as subtract and difference, except instead of making things darker, it makes things lighter. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to save again and dive into some effects and background elements, or accents as I sometimes call it. I'm going to look at the companion piece one more time so that they have similar blending modes between accents. This part varies depending on the piece, so I'm going to fast forward to the end. And we're done. I like to add one last overlay layer that covers everything at the top of the list with a single color for an overall tone. I chose a darker kind of purple for this piece. And yeah, that's about it. This drawing and the companion drawing are two pieces I'm pretty happy with. This technique is one of my more simple ones just because I don't have like 35 million layers and like 40 folders. I hope it was helpful. Even if you don't have Photoshop, you can use a lot of the same techniques in Fire Alpaca and probably Paint Toolside. As for the blending options, both of the other applications have similar blending modes you can try. I might make a separate tutorial going through all those blending modes if any of you would be interested. I'm glad I could put this tutorial together because I love Photoshop and it's super easy to use once you're pointed in the right direction and not afraid to experiment with different settings and modes and buttons. Just go to town. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!